Welcome to FCJ Refugee Center's webinar today. And thank you guys so much for joining us. So my name is Lena Abdul-Kilik. I am the Access to Education Placement student from York University. And I'm also joined here by Stefan, who's FCJ's Youth and Access to Education Program Coordinator. And I just wanted to kind of shout out Maytree because all of the webinars that we do for the Access to Education, we're able to implement them because of the support that we receive from Maytree. So we're going to start off by reading the land acknowledgement. So the land we are gathered on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat people. And it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And we normally do this every time, just because we do want to live by the land acknowledgement. It's not just about acknowledging it. And we want to make sure that we understand that there is that history and the rights of the Indigenous communities who were inhabitants of this land and who were caretakers of this land. So we want to make sure that we're continuously thinking about that shared history. And we want it to kind of serve as a reminder for us to continuously being responsible for this land. We do live on it, we work on it, we study in it, we benefit from it, and so we want to make sure that we're continuing that, and we're making sure that there is that reciprocity where we are giving to the land just as much as we are taking from it. So just keep that in mind in your day-to-day lives. So today we're going to be talking about the Rocky Path report card project, the first phase of it. And so we're going to kind of do a little bit of review, just a snippet of what the difference between the regularized and precarious statuses mean. We're going to talk about the report card, a brief overview. We're going to talk about the findings or the marks associated with that report card. We're then going to be discussing in a bit more detail the barriers that people face, specifically those with precarious status. We're going to talk about the 5 salient themes. So barriers to getting in, the barriers to equitable participation, barriers to support, to the support that individuals receive at the schools, discrimination, and then the moving on salient theme. Then we'll finally kind of wrap up with the current advocacy efforts, and we'll talk about what's going to be happening next webinar. So who we are and the kind of services that we offer. So FCJ Refugee Center is a nonprofit organization, and we work with refugees, but specifically those with precarious migrant status. And again, we're going to talk about kind of what that means. Now, we do provide information, we provide counseling and support to those newcomers in order to be able to integrate into the Canadian system. We address systemic issues that our newly arrived individuals or refugee claimants will face. And that could include the lack of resources. It could be marginalization, could be discrimination. So we kind of try to tackle those. And then we really just serve anyone who comes to us for assistance. So here is kind of a breakdown of the services and resources that we offer. We do have many different kind of departments. So we've got the settlement and integration portion of our overall, and that's where the access to education falls. That's also where the youth the youth programs also fall under this category as well. Then we've got immigration support, and that includes anything from refugee claimant processes, helping out with that process, help navigating that process, as well as sponsorships or work permit process assistance. Now, we also offer the anti-human trafficking program, and that helps survivors of human trafficking. So this focuses on labor inequities and exploitation in the workplace. And we focus on sex being used as a form of human trafficking. So as well as education being used as a form of human trafficking. So we provide kind of support with the immigration portion of that. We then also have the public education and networking part of our programs. And this is where you'll have access to these webinars, podcasts, and newsletters, and they can be found on the website. I've also linked them later on in at the end of the slideshow. This is also where you'll find like current events and updates on any advocacy efforts that we're working on right now. We also have our contact information here, but that'll be at the end as well. And these slides will also be shared once it's uploaded to the website. So here are the two categories of status in Canada. So there's regularized, and this is just kind of going to be a brief overview, like just a review, I guess. So there's regularized status, and that includes anyone with Canadian citizenship, permanent residency, or refugee status and protected persons. And then precarious status is where we kind of focus in on, and that's any individuals that are going through the refugee claimant process. This also includes those that have been refused refugee claimants. This is also individuals that are kind of caught in limbo due to immigration policy changes that may have happened once after they've applied. So this is where their status is a little bit precarious there. Survivors of human trafficking and any undocumented status. So anyone living in Canada without immigration documents. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, I guess. So the FCJ Youth Network, it's essentially a space where newcomers and migrant youth, they come together. It's a specific portion of the FCJ. It's under the FCJ Refugee Centers family. But the youth network, it's a space where kind of newcomers and migrant youth, they come together to learn, build, and participate in community development, community building. So back in 2016, members of the FCJ Youth Network, they compiled a report. And the report was, the aim of that report was to assess the access to education at the secondary level. And then they also tried to assess the transition from secondary to a higher post-secondary education. Now, that kind of led that report, that 2016. I may have said 2006. I apologize. It's 2016. But that 2016 report eventually led to a follow-up report. And this is what you're looking at right now. It was titled A Rocky Path. And the aim of this was to kind of understand the challenges and the barriers that newcomers face in accessing education in Ontario. Now, this is where they found both reports actually had found that there was key areas of focus, and that's what I keep referring to as the 5 salient themes. So those themes were getting in, equitable participation, anti-discrimination, support, and moving on. Now, the report did shed light on like the necessary need for improvement and change to happen within our education system. And the report also kind of offered strategies that, if implemented and if put into practice, would and could ignite a positive change within our education system. So we're going to do a little bit of brief overview on that. So the new report was actually divided into two phases before we get into this. Actually, yes, phase one. So the new report, so the Rocky Path report, was divided into two phases. So phase one, which has already come out back in it was supposed to be for the 2024 school year end. And that was there to assess not only the high school or the secondary education system, but it assessed the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary education systems. And it provided the areas of improvement essentially. Now, phase two has been completed. And that was to gather kind of updates on the implementations that were suggested for the strategies that were suggested in the phase one report, and to see where we are, kind of how well we've done and how well we've progressed. Now, phase two, we will be talking about next week's webinar. I don't believe it's been published as of yet, but it has been completed. So we're going to be today discussing phase one. And so as you can see here, this was the report card, the overall report card for the phase one. And there is definitely significant need for improvement. As you can see, the grades are not up to par as to what they should be. So we're going to be talking about those barriers that the newcomers face, and specifically those that are of precarious status. Now, from the start of the enrollment process up until they're in school, and hence why we kind of start off with the getting in, and then we move on to the moving on part, which is them transitioning out of school. So we're going to be discussing each component, and what each component focuses in on. But as you can see, the highest priority, based on school year end of 2024, was the moving on theme. And that was a D- grade, unfortunately. Now, this is kind of just a refresher of the levels of education in Ontario that are available, and as well as like what it entails, a brief summary of what it entails. But essentially, it's elementary, which is, ages 4 to 13. So that's kindergarten to grade 8. Then student moves on to secondary, which is so high school, 14 years of age to about 18 years of age. And that's from grades 9 to grade 12. And then you've got advanced and adult school. So with the advanced program, it's for those students that maybe have not completed high school once they've reached the age of 18. So they're able to continue their high school, get their high school degree, their OSSD, through the advanced programs. And then you've got the adult schools for those that are 21 years of age or older. Now, with the first two, with the elementary and secondary, there is the Education Act of 93 does state that schools are not able to kind of refuse the admission of those students, regardless of their status. Now, with the advanced school and the adult school, however, they do need to have some type of regularized status in order to be able to get into those schools. And then you've got post-secondary school, and that for those students that do have the precarious status, they are able to proceed with a post-secondary education, however, only at two universities, so Toronto Metropolitan University and York University. Now, before we get into what the report represents as the key barriers to accessing education in Ontario, I'm going to kind of talk about some of the general barriers that individuals with precarious status face in our education system. Some of these, not necessarily just in the education system, they are in society as a whole, but since we are Access to Education and I am a placement student for that, we're going to be talking specifically in the education system. Now, some of the barriers would be fear. Now, there is the fear of persecution, there is the fear of discrimination, detention, and sometimes even deportation. So there is a lot of fear that individuals have when feeling the need to disclose, if they feel the need to disclose. So there's a lot of fear there. Then the second one is also understanding the right of each status. And this is really from all levels of stakeholders involved. So the precarious status individual and the school, all the way through to the school individuals or school representatives. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding of what each status is right is within the system. So understanding the rights, that's a barrier. Um, this one's a big one too, because people are always, because of that fear, um, of disclosing, people are unaware of the confidentiality regarding status. So individuals may not understand that they have rights and specifically rights with regards to confidentiality. So this means this refers to really who the school can and can't tell, because there is the right, they do need to disclose their status, but they don't necessarily need to disclose, their story and why their status is the way that it is. And then the school, they only need that for the admission process. They don't need it for anything else. So there is that confidentiality that is around disclosing that status to the school. Now, I did want to talk about the memorandum. We're going to be talking a little bit more about it in a few more slides. But there was the SB 16 memorandum, and it took effect in September of 2024. And they kind of just updated the previous memorandum, which was SB 08, just with more better wording, I guess. But one of the specific quotes that I wanted to take was photocopies take from that document to read to you. Photocopies of a student's or parent's personal or immigration document should not be retained in a student's OSR, Ontario student record, at the time of registration. So this was there prior. However, they've updated the document to also add an additional line which says the ministry expects school board staff to review the original document and then immediately return the documentation to the parent or guardian. And this again is to kind of alleviate that confidentiality fear in our precarious status individuals. Now, the last one of the last ones that I've written down is the level of knowledge of individuals' rights to accessing education. And this is really referring to the Education Act, that there's the inability to refuse a youth student an education. Now, there's fee exemptions also that are based on immigration documents or immigration, status. Some people aren't aware of those, and each immigration status does have a slightly different fee exemption policy. So that is where the level of knowledge that an individual would have would help them in breaking down these barriers. Documentation is also a barrier. The knowledge around documentation is also a barrier, because some people don't know what documentations are required, and we're going to kind of briefly touch on that a little bit later. And then the next steps to enrolling. Sometimes it is difficult to find that information. So not having the knowledge of where to look and what to do next hinders their enrollment experience or their enrollment process. And then lastly, the reduced knowledge of responsibilities from the school board and the school representatives. Now, in addition to this, there is sometimes, unfortunately, the spread of inaccurate information and suggestions that are made by the school that may not be helpful for the individual. And this creates a barrier for the students and their families not only in accessing education, but also for potentially their immigration process. And so this may be unintentional on their part, but nevertheless, it does hinder their ability to be able to access education and kind of integrate and proceed with their lives in Canada. So the first barrier in accessing education, the first salient theme was getting in, the getting in step. Now, this is the part of the report that reported on how stakeholders, so a stakeholder could be principals, vice principals, secretaries, those that are involved within the school, how they can help or impede newcomers, and specifically those with precarious status from getting into school. So it's it involves the process of gathering information for the enrollment process. So the documentation required, how to go about getting information that may or may not be readily available online, and then having to sift through school administration or school representatives in order to get accurate and up-to-date information. Sometimes you're being passed along from one individual to the next in order for you to get the accurate, up-to-date information. And so this is where kind of the initial hurdle lies. So when information is not clearly communicated to individuals, or it's not readily available to everyone involved in the process, it leads to, unfortunately, the potential for like a vague policies to be misunderstood and miscommunicated. And so those that are looking to register their students in school are then receiving inaccurate information potentially. Now, it also could lead to newcomers either being unlawfully refused access or they kind of get the runaround, right? Until they're able to find an organization like FCJ to kind of help in verifying the information that they've been given and the instructions that they've been told to do by the school. And that's where the common barriers to getting in kind of really start to set in. Now, some of these barriers to getting in, they could include language barriers. And obviously, communication is necessary in order to be able to get the proper information, but that can be difficult when there is a language barrier between the school representatives and the individuals, the newcomers. So that kind of hinders their ability to get in. The lack of resources, such as computer or internet for the individual trying to register. Now, most of the registration processes, as we've talked about in previous webinars, they are done online. So without having access to a computer or internet, newcomers are finding barriers in that registration process. They're unable to do so because of that lack of resources that they have access to. Now, kind of in correlation to that, the lack of technological literacy can also affect the families when they're trying to register their children online. So if they're not very literate in technological devices, it's unfortunately it hinders that process as well, and it delays their process. The next barrier is locating information. So when you're trying to locate the information, whether it's about the enrollment process itself or about the documents that you're required to provide to the school, sometimes the families are not given the up-to-date information about those requirements from the school level. So if they do go into the school and say, hey, what kind of documents do I need? They're unfortunately not given that up-to-date information. And then they're therefore having to kind of resort to doing their own research themselves or finding organizations that can kind of help them in that process. Now, participants from the Rocky Path report were polled, and 65% of them had said that they encountered difficulties in accessing information for the enrollment process, whereas only 35% of them had said that they were provided support and guidance from the school staff. And that's a big chunk of individuals. It's more than half of the individuals that were not necessarily able to access the information in order to access the education. So that's something that definitely needs to be worked on. Fee exemption admissions also is a hurdle that individuals with all individuals really need to overcome. So with families that have precarious status specifically, the Education Act of 93, and it's under section 49.1, it ensures that minors are not denied an education, as well, I've stated before. But with the SB 16 memorandum that's come out, updates were actually made to clarify the exemption requirements for each individual immigration status that was set out under subsection, I believe, 49.7, I think. Yes, it was. I'm just looking over my notes. Yes, it's point 0.7. And the so there lost my train of thought. So yes, fee exemption admissions also is a hurdle, because if you don't qualify under those exemptions, then you are having to then pay the full fees for schooling, and some newcomers with precarious status unfortunately aren't able to do so. And the second last barrier that was discussed in the report, or that they found in the report, was the fear of disclosing your immigration status, as we've talked about previously. But you also have precarious immigrants, precarious status immigrants, should know that their right to, they have the ability to refuse to disclose the story surrounding their status. So in order for them to be enrolled into school, they do need to share their status. However, they don't necessarily have to go into the details of why and their story and how that status became to be their status. So that's something that kind of school representatives may be asking a little bit more questions than they need to. And so knowing, having the knowledge to say that's not necessary, you don't need to know that, could create less of a barrier for individuals and less fear for individuals. And then the last one is the inconsistency in the information that's provided at the school level or the board level. Now, this is specifically with the documentation requirements. And this is kind of where the legal jargon comes into play. That's in the Education Act, and in the SB 16 memorandum. So in the memorandum, actually, there has been a wording update to one specific point, and I'm going to read that out to you. It says school boards are advised to seek advice from their legal counsel when interpreting the requirements as set out in the Education Act. And so the word interpreting is the one that's kind of bolded. It's the new one. And this sentence itself leaves room for the schools and the school boards to interpret the requirements, as opposed to just having set rules all across all school boards. And so it hinders the ability for a person to get information, especially when, maybe English is not their first language, or they're coming to Canada and it's a brand new, like it's culture shock, right? You're coming to a whole new country, and now you're getting potentially misinformation or inconsistency information from school to school or from school board to school board. So these are the barriers that were addressed in the getting in portion of the report. Now, the vague directions, and I say vague because they kind of are fake, because they're asking individual school boards to interpret the ministry documents. So this vague direction and instruction that was found in previous policies led to the misinterpretation at the school level, right, of what was acceptable documentation based on their status. Now, at the time that this report, the Rocky Path report, was published, the SB 08 memorandum was in effect, not the memorandum that we're talking about. And I've linked the SB, the newest one, SB 16 memorandum. I've linked it here if you would like to take a look at it. But this one is where, the one that I've been mentioning, is where it was issued back in September of 2024, and it just kind of clarified many of the documentation requirements. It also clarified a whole bunch of other things, but specifically documentation was clarified. Now, some of the key changes, I've only listed a few of them, but the ministry does expect the staff to review the documentation, the original documentation, and then have to return it back. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, where it's not included in their OSR, their Ontario student records. It doesn't get saved, it just simply gets returned back. Now, the following documentations are what was updated and the following documents are kind of what was clarified as acceptable documents that could be used to determine residency of the student. So it was either a utility bill, property tax bill, a phone bill, but this does have to be like a landline, and so on and so forth, a lease agreement. And then something else that was added to this was if an individual is not able to produce any of these bills in their name, then they could get a letter that was signed from a friend or family member that they're staying with, simply stating that they are staying with them, and that precarious status family is staying with them. And then that friend or family member that had written that letter would then provide one of these requirements for residency as evidence. And then for the fee exemptions, the Ontario residency requirement does need to be met in order for you to be fee exempt, or for the individual to be fee exempt. Now, once the students are now enrolled in school, their students are supposed to be offered supports to help them succeed in school. Um, and so these students have access to after school programs such as homework help, sports, arts, extracurricular activities. And these are kind of used to help integrate the student into the school. Some schools do offer some of these, some don't. It just varies based on the individual school. Academic support is also one that should be offered at all schools, and this is English as a second language programs. The academic support doesn't necessarily just mean English as a second language, the ESL programs, because they're not available in all of the schools. But potentially tutoring, mentorship programs that are provided by the school or community organizations. Academic support could also be like a support teacher that maybe comes into the school and assists individual students that may require additional help, whether it's in the classroom or where they're pulled out of the classroom and they're helped in a private setting or a more private setting with a few other individuals at their level. Another support that's supposed to be offered is social and emotional support. And this is through educators such as the contact teacher or a resource teacher. They may be called different things in different schools, as I've seen, but their role essentially is the same. They're there to support the students with their adjustments socially, emotionally, into the education system. And then another support that's supposed to be offered is potentially financial aid for post-secondary students. And as you can see, it is a grade level of C. So just below, based on like the ABCD system, grading system in school, it is below expectations. So some work is required there. Now, in theory, those are, and I kept saying they're supposed to be, these are the supports that are supposed to be offered, because in theory, they should be in place in all schools. However, newcomers, as well as some marginalized individuals, they often face barriers to getting that support in school. And so some of those barriers could be not being proactively offered these additional academic supports. So if you don't know about them and if you or your clients don't know about them and aren't being offered them, then there would be no way of them knowing that these academic supports exist and therefore can't go to the school and ask for it. So that's where the proactiveness of that offer, it hinders, if there is no proactivity, it hinders the ability for the individual to get that academic support. There's also no consistency in program offerings. So such as I mentioned, ESL is not provided at all schools. ELL, English language learners, and English as a second language programs. They do vary from school to school. And from the people that were polled within the Rocky Path report, 50% of the participants shared that the school did not offer them any academic support at the moment of enrollment. And so while the other 50% did share that the school offered them ESL programs, it does showcase the lack of a consistency. Half being offered is not enough. There should be more proactive offering of these programs. Then there's also the funding limitations, right? Because with funding limitations, they do create variability, that inconsistency in the availability of support. And this causes that lack of consistency that we talked about. So some regions may offer a certain type of support, but that one type of report may not be offered in another area or another board or even at another school within the same board. So an example of this would be sanctuary scholars that the university students with precarious status are offered at the two universities that I briefly touched on and we'll talk about in a bit. But they're not offered at all universities, and they're currently not offered at any of the colleges. So that funding, the limited funding, creates that inconsistency in the availability of that support. And post-secondary education. So that's that post-secondary education funding that we just talked about. But there's also the additional layer of the government funding that students receive through OSAP. It's not there. It's not available to those with precarious status because of their status. And so that makes it harder for those individuals to continue their studies. So they're kind of having to stop and worry about how are they going to pay for this? How are they going to pay for post-secondary education? There's also the social integration and emotional support barrier. Now, even with the resource teachers or the contact teachers that I talked about that are there to support the students' integration, some are not even aware that this is available to them. So again, if you don't know it exists, then you don't know it exists. You can't ask for something you don't know about. And so that's where there's that barrier to get that support because you don't know about it. And so others do struggle with the language barriers and they're not able to socially integrate. And so without that social integration, these students with the precarious status or newcomers, they may have a harder time emotionally coping with the changes in their lives. And so it's kind of like a catch 22, 21, 22, where one thing affects the other and then the other affects the first thing. And so they're socially not being able to integrate, which affects their emotional coping and then therefore affects their academic, right? So it kind of all does affect each other. And then we've got the culturally responsive support. So this is being a student teacher, a teacher candidate. This is something that is very big in the university when you are getting your Bachelor of Education, culturally responsive support, um, because we do have a vast diversity in our schools, in our society, but also in our schools specifically. And students, therefore, may not feel heard or supported, right? So when students are not feeling like they are supported or they are, um, we are being responsive to their needs and their individual needs, their cultural needs, whatever it may be, it negatively impacts them and their academic and their social development. And then, therefore, again, affecting their emotional development. And so I know that I know that this is something that school boards are working on, as well as, the universities and all across the GTA. I know that this is something that we're working on, but unfortunately, that progress just has not been quick enough, and that's something that does need to be broken down. That barrier of culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive support does need to be broken down in order for us to do better. And then lastly, the last barrier to the support received in school is limited connections from the school with the community partners that support those newcomers. So, for example, a school in, FCJ's area may not have those connections with FCJ, whereas FCJ is the one there supporting those newcomers, and those schools are there or should be there to support those newcomers. So that kind of connection between the two should be there between the school and the community partners. And I think this is a big one because there is that disconnect, right? And so while you're working in school, while I've been working in school, I have seen firsthand the positive impact that bringing the community into our schools has had on student success. Because in the end, these individuals have their own lives outside of school. These students have their own lives outside of school. So we need to be able to bring kind of that community in and build that consistent relationship where we're working together with the community partners and the school board or the schools individually. And it's truly essential. I feel it's essential for our student success in order for that integration to happen. And this is also applies to those that are marginalized, not just to newcomers. Unfortunately, this does kind of that limited connection does apply to those marginalized individuals as well. Now, so there were, so again, from the report, the Rocky Path report, there was a poll that was done, and there was a mixed response in data from those families, and it was regarding the support that they received, whether it was informed, adequate support. Now, some families did indicate that they did not receive any support at all. And that, unfortunately, was approximately 62% of those that were polled, where they said they did not receive any support at all. And they kind of needed to navigate the system themselves. They needed to um, do the things they needed to do in order to support themselves. And they also said that they needed to they needed to um, get that support themselves, and they only received the support when there was kind of like a time of crisis when they could not do it on their own. Now, some of them did say that they received support, um, but the staff unfortunately lacked the understanding of their status. So they didn't understand the specificity of their status, and so they were then offered inadequate remedies. So only 7.7 of the total individuals polled had said that they received both adequate and informed support from the school, which is such a low number. And that definitely needs to be worked on because that support should be proactively provided for our individuals in the school system. Now, Fourth salient, I believe it was fourth, yes. The fourth salient theme that was discussed was anti-discrimination. Now, sometimes due to immigration status, or it could even be socioeconomic status, the individual's race, gender, um, disability bias is also a thing, among others. There is this power imbalance. There's this perceived power imbalance. And so when that power imbalance occurs, it kind of creates a barrier to the quality of education that our marginalized communities receive from the school. Now, when that happens, it does often lead to safety concerns for some of those individuals that may not feel as though they are safe or that they are in an inclusive environment free from discrimination and bias. And so often these discriminations and sometimes implicit biases, we all have them, but they often result in bullying, whether it's, on school property or after school or online. And the unfortunate thing is that the response to the bullying from the schools, from the school and the school staff, unfortunately, is delayed or it's just dismissive completely. So this does lead to those marginalized individuals feeling unsafe, feeling unheard, and feeling undervalued, right? And so if you take a look at it, it is a D, which is very close to failure. And so this is something that does need to be worked on school boards level. But the individual barriers or the direct barriers to this that the Rocky Report had found was the lack of certain policies or procedures that eventually leads to those injustices against those being discriminated against or bullied. Now, it does perpetuate certain unacceptable behaviors in schools when when if you were to see an individual that is being discriminated against and nothing is happening to the individual that is doing the bullying or doing the discrimination, it does kind of perpetuate that unacceptable behavior further in schools. So something that they had talked about was the need for an anti-discrimination policy. This is something that has already been done in other parts of the world. And it's a policy or it's an agreement, not a policy, sorry, it's an agreement that's signed by the student and their guardians. And oh, sorry about that. And most schools in Ontario don't have this. So what we do have is a code of conduct. But the code of conduct is kind of like a recommended expectations, which is perfectly fine, but it's not a binding agreement. So an anti-discrimination agreement would be better suited so that individuals know what the consequences would be of you not following through with it, or you doing the discrimination, unfortunately. The second point that I wanted to make was the lack of response or delay in responding to the bullying by whether it's the school or the school officials. And again, this leaves the individual feeling unsafe and helpless, and therefore perpetuating the unacceptable behavior in school. The next barrier is the lack of professional development training for educators. And this is surrounding like what to do in case of bullying. If your students experience it and they come to you, if you see it on the playground, what would you do? What's the next steps? Now, training is much needed on how to meet the needs of newcomer students as well to help them integrate more effectively into the classroom and into the school community as a whole. So this is there's also this like lack of cultural sensitivity training, um, which unfortunately has grave impact on the student's overall success. Because if you're not culturally sensitive or culturally responsive, then you're not doing that student or that child a service. You're actually doing them a disservice because you don't have that sensitivity training where it's impacting, the way they view school and the way they view school officials as well. And the last barrier, and this applies to everything, but specifically in schools, is, as I mentioned earlier, we all have implicit biases, biases that we don't even know exist. We may think of something, and this is what we grew up with. And so it's important to really focus on those. Think about, be conscious of the biases that you may or may not have. And those unchecked biases, whether it's towards, people of different race or of different religion or different immigration status, right? Those biases do isolate those individuals because you're perpetuating that discrimination against them, whether you intend to or not. And the last salient theme is moving on. Now, this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, it is the worst rated or the lowest scored on the report. And this section of the report simply looked into how effective the school staff was in offering advice and support to those students that were transitioning out from one level to the next level. And this could be staff like teachers or guidance counselors or even administrators. And so the report also considered how this advice takes into account the limitations of those youth with certain statuses, with certain non-regularized statuses. Now, with let's stay on this one. With the transition from elementary level, it's normally an easier transition of all of them, just because they're the students' rights and their opportunities and the accessibility that they have to the next stage in their education levels, they are protected. When they move from elementary to secondary system, there is that those protected rights and opportunities that are there. So this one's generally the easiest transition. Now, for the secondary level transition into post-secondary, this does require a bit more attention from the school staff. And the attention that's required there, it's surrounding, I guess, the needs of the students, the hopes, but also the expectations of the students, right? This is where the students with certain immigration statuses, they are limited into what the next step could be. And that does need to be taken into consideration. Unfortunately, sometimes that is limited or simply overlooked. Their status is simply overlooked, I guess. Yes. Now, for the advance in the adult school programs, transitioning out of those, the staff does need to consider where the student is in their immigration journey. Because even though they do require certain types of status to get into the advanced and adult school programs, it's not necessarily those statuses may not necessarily be able to get them into a post-secondary education such as university or college. So the school staff do need to be conscious of that, and they do need to be mindful of that. Now, the post-secondary transition out into the workforce. So even though this is where the Sanctuary Scholars Program, as well as like the bridging program will work or will come into play. So even though those Sanctuary Scholars programs do provide the students with a degree or academic credentials when they're complete, it doesn't guarantee them work status or it doesn't guarantee them a regularized immigration status because those Sanctuary Scholars programs, that Sanctuary Scholars program is geared towards those with precarious status. So if they have not moved further along in the process, their immigration process, and they graduate, they complete the Sanctuary Scholars Program, and they're still precarious status, um, the staff needs to consider that in order for them to be able to assist them in the transition, because they won't be able to get into the workplace until they're able to get a regularized status or like a work permit. So people need to, or the individuals helping that transition process need to be aware and conscious of this. Now that we've talked about kind of what is involved in the moving on, the barriers to the moving on process, we're going to talk about three specifically. The lack of specialized academic and career counseling that specifically focuses on the needs of those newcomer students. Now, this could include things like course selection, post-secondary pathways for those, again, with precarious status, or even just career planning. Um, there is that lack of specialization in that counseling portion of the transitioning or the moving out process. The second one here is the lack of bridging programs and pathways for newcomers. So as I mentioned, the Sanctuary Scholars Program at York University and Toronto Metropolitan University, and the bridging programs that are offered by York University, those are the only places that offer programs, post-secondary programs for individuals or for students without regularized status. And so this needs to be offered. There is that lack of programs that are available to newcomers. And that is a barrier, because if you don't fit into any of those, if you're not able to get into any of those programs, then you're kind of left having to wait. And even the expansion of these programs into colleges as well, because there are no colleges that offer any programs such as this that are geared towards those students with precarious status. And so you're left with only a few options and not a lot of other bridging programs to choose from. And then oh, sorry about that. The third barrier to moving on, and this is probably the heaviest one, it's the financial support, right? Those students that are looking to continue their post-secondary education are not able to do so sometimes because the government funding, such as OSAP, it's only offered to those with regularized status. So it leaves those students with the precarious status unable to take on that financial burden of post-secondary studies. And so therefore it kind of stops. It halts their transition from post-secondary studies, or sorry, into post-secondary studies. And so that's a big barrier for a lot of people, a lot of individuals, because it does get expensive. And so not having that financial support is kind of it hinders your getting in and moving on to post-secondary. Now, as you can see here, I've kind of put the two report cards side by side for you to view. So on the left-hand side, there's the 2016 report card and the 2024 report card on the right-hand side, the phase one. And you can see that there is a bit of progress. We have to acknowledge the good a little bit, but unfortunately, it's not enough of a change for us to kind of just give up and say, yeah, this is good enough, because it's not good enough. And so nonprofit organizations such as FCJ Refugee Center, among others, who support newcomers, we are needed to help move the needle further towards an education system that is equitable for all individuals and regardless of their status. And so we need to kind of continue that momentum and continue going and continue working for more positive change. Now, does anybody have any questions? Sorry, Stefan, can you just take a look at, I don't want to come out of this because I'm sharing my whole desktop. Can you see
I
if there's
think we lost a couple of folks that were in. There doesn't seem to be any questions, so we should be good to wrap up.
Okay, sounds good. So here are some of the upcoming events that are coming up. So specifically the two on the side, the art show and benefit of 2025. So FCJ Refugee Center and our neighbors, we're going to be hosting an art and show benefit from April 4th to 6th. And we're actually looking for talented and artists that are refugee artists who would like to submit their art for the exhibition. It could be, poetry, sculptures, drawings, paintings, anything. Now, the deadline to submit your art is March 14th. And I've provided the link both in the words as well as on the call for artists purple photo. The other upcoming event is the International Women's Day 2025 rally in March. That's going to be in Toronto on March 8th. Oh, March 8th. Yes. And that's to celebrate International Women's Day, and it's really aimed to just empower all girls and women. So if you can come out, it's this weekend. And I'm going to skip that. And then the save the date. I'm asking that you guys save the date. So our next webinar is going to be next week, same time, March 11th on Tuesday at 12. And it's just going to be a part 2 of barriers to accessing education, where we're going to go over key takeaways from the February 2025, the phase 2 of the Ontario Education Report Card. And so that'll be next week. And I'm just going to leave this up here. If you have any questions, comments, please reach out to our socials as well as phone number and email addresses on there. Stefan, do you want to add anything?
No, that was perfect, Lena. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording.